You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com. Welcome to We Are Libertarians. My name is Chris Spangle. This is another edition of The Swamp Explained, where I talk to Rob Quartel, who is a 45-year fly on the wall in Washington, D.C. Rob has worked for Republican presidential campaigns like Ford and HW, government agencies like the EPA. He's been confirmed by the Senate to the U.S. Maritime Commission. He's also been a candidate for Congress and Senate. And he's also spent years working in private technology in that sector with startup companies and lived around Washington, D.C. for a long time. And, you know, he has iconoclastic viewpoints, lots of experience, and he always gives us great insight into how people are thinking there in Washington, D.C. The reason we do the show is, you know, if you're a libertarian and you want to start trimming down the swamp and the government, then you've got to understand it. Oftentimes, Rob, what I find in talking to people on social media is that their facts don't match reality. Gut facts, but you wouldn't know that if you spent all day online.
I totally agree with that. And you know, there's an old saying that where you stand depends on where you sit. Mm-hmm. One and two. You know, this we were talking earlier offline, you and I, about Miles Taylor. A good example of people both using someone for advantage and then abusing them for advantage and everything else, you know. Yeah,
we can start here, and then we're going to talk about the 2020 race in this last episode of The Swamp before the election. We will, on Monday night, have another episode just to kind of tie it all together, a preview of Election Day, so tune in and make sure you listen to that as well. But Miles Taylor is this guy who was an assistant to the Homeland Security, was it
Well, he was deputy chief of staff,
okay.
And then he later became chief of staff. And so, you know, when he at some point he gives us he writes a story in the paper and about being in some meetings and being appalled. And then, of course, everyone knows it is true that there are a lot of people inside the administration who are conflicted about one policy or another, and kind of just their friends are banging on them about what a jackass Donald Trump is.
We've seen it with people like Kelly and Mattis, and a lot of these. You sent me an article with 29 different people, and Miles Taylor was there when Kristen Nielsen.
He was with Kirsten. Yeah,
and so during all these child separations, he was chief of staff during all that.
That's right.
And then around that time, the New York Times published this anonymous article. We talked about it here on the podcast. And
that's right. And he was characterized as a senior administration official.
Yes. And he wrote a book.
Right.
And then
he came out.
He came out personally, and I heard him on the Bulwark podcast, which I thought was a very interesting look. And he left 3 years into being this deputy chief of staff. And I found a lot of what he had to say convincing. He didn't seem like a nut. He didn't seem like a, you know,
he's not.
They kind of pushed him on being like, how could you like be there, be a part of the child separation and not say anything? And his argument was always, well, I wanted to be one of those people who stopped him. I thought he'd be different than he was. He wasn't. Now I'm speaking out, which I sort of buy that argument.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say right up front, that reminds me of something my wife said to me at the beginning, before the last election in 2016, which is, if he won, who would work for him? And
Right.
what I said then is anybody he asked. He's the president of the United States.
Yeah.
And people, and in his case, I think a lot of people who were Republicans, of course, it's in a Republican administration. They wanted to work in it, and they all had hopes that he would be different. He would seize the moment. And then there are others who think they're smarter than he is, and that they can change him. And it's always like that. That also reminds me of the story of George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Baker, and he and Baker were disagreeing. We talked about this before. And at some point, Bush said, "Well, if you're so smart, why aren't you president?" And so these are the kinds of it's a human interaction, and people do go into government for generally positive reasons, and generally younger people go in to advance their careers. And I remember what I was like after when I was in the Ford administration. I was 23 and 4, and later under Bush, and you really you have to kind of believe that what you're going to be able to do is good and a little independent of other stuff. So I don't criticize him for doing it or being in it. But what is interesting is in the beginning, when he did the first article, when they publish an article, they actually know, even if it's anonymous, they know who it is. Mm-hmm. And they can't, and they agree to do it on the basis of their position that something bad will happen. So obviously they knew who he was, and they have to characterize it. So when the press goes out, and they do it on background, they'll say, "I just talked to a senior administration official who said blah, 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 blah," on background. And so now they're the nattering nabobs, as Spiro Agnew used to say, and that was written by Patrick Buchanan, I think. Mm-hmm. For him, was was he really a senior administration official, and should you give him any credibility? Well, let me just say, senior administration officials are not just cabinet officials or sub-cabinet. They're people who run the agencies. So he was deputy chief of staff, and then chief of staff. So by any definition, he was a senior official in the Department of Homeland Security. He obviously reported directly to the secretary and the undersecretary, but he was a senior official. And if he was a senior official there, then he was a senior administration official, and he had credibility. And he was part of this generation.
Yeah, and he sat in the Oval Office. He briefed Donald Trump. So for those who don't, he said
he was in on every major briefing. That would be absolutely true while he was chief of staff.
Yeah, can you kind of explain what a chief of staff does at that level for those who may not be familiar with that particular role?
Sure. Yeah, totally. So these are, all these agencies are huge bureaucracies, and the typical structure is you have a secretary, and then you have an undersecretary who would be like a chief operating officer in a big corporation. And then under that, you have department heads, and so Homeland Security has ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, and they have a science director, and they have I've forgotten how many there are now, maybe as many as 10 or 12. And each of these is like an assistant secretary for whatever, except in the case of ICE and CBP, Customs and Immigration. They actually are commissioners, so they have a title that is somewhat like the title I had, except they're not independent. They still report up the chain of command through the undersecretary, and sometimes they're deputy secretaries. And by the way, kind of the old rule in Washington is the longer your title, the lower you are. So like the special assistant to the deputy undersecretary of whatever, that kind of stuff. It means you are a no one. But the chief of staff, they all have someone to kind of run the office policy side. So you have a policy shop and someone who's an assistant secretary for that. But someone has to be there and really kind of coordinate everything that goes on. The secretary's schedule, who he sees, his speeches. Often they're in charge of speech writing. They frequently have they are the last guy to have control over who sees them and who gets in and out. So a chief of staff can be a very, very powerful position in an agency. And I had one, and even on a small staff, you want someone who you turn around to and say, take care of this. And you really have to trust them. And they, by the way, know everything you know, typically. So he was a senior administration official. It wasn't just a benefit to the New York Times to call him that, or whoever wrote, I forgot whether he did in the Times or the Post, but, and then later, of course, when he wrote his book, it was appropriate for him to call himself a senior administration official. So, so this is one of those kind of silly swamp nits, and the reason they're doing it is they're trying to undermine his credibility. Well, he's a credible guy. Every chief of staff knows every other chief of staff, and believe me, they all talk.
Sure.
And they, he goes out drinking with his friends. He's a young guy. I don't know if he's married or whatever, but so there's a whole layer of people like him who are loyal, but they're also concerned. And part of their job is to keep people out of trouble, not to get them into trouble. I'm watching this great Netflix show now called Borgen. And it's about the Danish government and the first woman prime minister, and all the politics. And, there it's very different. The chief of staff is, in fact, virtually everybody who works for her is a professional civil servant. So
right.
Talk about the swamp. And she has her own cabinet officials, but they're all members of other parties to form a government. And, that's the way it is in all parliamentary democracies. It's like that in England and all the rest. It's a great show, by the way. I would definitely recommend it. If you like politics, it's great. If you like character development, it's terrific. And believe me, it's a mile a minute twists and turns, but it is the ultimate idea of a swamp. In the U.S., most of these positions, I've forgotten how many we still have left. There used to be 4,000 or 5,000 positions in what was called the Plum Book, which is when a president came in, he got to appoint all these people, and only a handful of them had to be confirmed by the Congress, by the Senate. And that number had been steadily whittled down. But positions like chief of staffs, they're loyalty positions.
Right. So, they're not permanent positions versus
not permanent. Yeah. He's out of here the day the next president comes in. Even if it's a Republican, the odds are he's out of here, and or he would have been if he were still in the job.
Yeah. To illustrate that, here in Indiana, when it went from the Mitch Daniels administration, who is a Republican, to the Mike Pence administration, there was a large number of Republicans that quit, resigned, wouldn't work for Mike Pence. Mike Pence didn't want them to work for him because they were too liberal or not ideologically right enough. And so there was a large amount of turnover in a lot of those agency head positions. But then there was also a filling of what I would call the American civil service positions. Like, our buddy Rob Kendall ended up working, as like on the insurance commission. Rob's a talk radio show host working for the insurance commission, but he had knocked on doors and needed a job. And so the Pence administration appointed him to the insurance commission. So, there's jobs like that, but he could have had that job for 20 years had he wanted to stay in it. There is a large...
Well, and there are a lot of things like that in government, and the other phenomenon you see, and this is where the swamp really becomes swampy, is administrations. Basically, you may be a political appointee, but what you do is you want to burrow in if you want to stay, because nothing like getting your 20 years in a pension and when you get out. And some people just like it. I must say, I probably have 20 friends who burrowed in, way back, all the way as far back as probably Ford, 40 years ago. And certainly some from the first Bush, and certainly many from the second Bush. And I know others from all the administration. They burrow in and become civil servants. And so,
yeah, I really I know a lot of center-right people won't look at a John Bolton interview or Miles Taylor interview, or I forget the lady who is also part of this speaking out about the administration. But if you read
the young woman.
Yeah, if you read these books, if you listen in these interviews, you get a great education. Like when he talked to the Bulwark podcast, Bolton gave you a great explanation of the rise of a career of a civil servant like John Bolton and all the places he worked and how he had moved up the ladder and who he had talked to and how these meetings run. Like, you really do. exposing yourself to the information does not mean that you're going to end up agreeing with, liking for, or wanting to vote the same way as John Bolton. It's just information that you take in.
Although Bolton, I think Bolton has largely been in political positions, certainly for the last 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So, and many start as a civil servant.
You start on a campaign and then you get appointed.
And of course, this is the crux of this. We talk about the swamp. What is the swamp? I meant to do a little research and see who first, called it the swamp. And the next time we get together, maybe I'll have that. But the swamp is, sometimes people think of it as the professionals who are there for 10, 20, 30 years, come thick or thin, Republican or Democrat. Sometimes it's not the civil service, it's the lobbyists who have similar careers through the thick and thin, and the yin and yang of all these administrations, and sometimes they mean the money that they throw around, and sometimes they mean the politicians. So the swamp has all sorts of layers of professionals. It's frankly, it's the classic American political argument where people think they don't want politicians, so-called career politicians, but do they want a career doctor, or they want a career dentist, or they want a career pilot, and politics is a profession, and the people in the civil service typically are people who have learned what it is they're supposed to do, and that many write about this, and they go through professional societies just like other people in other professions, and they do their job, and you and I have talked on numerous occasions that where Trump has failed most mightily is in failing to appoint people who could represent his point of view and make his imprint on government. There are hundreds of these, or there have been hundreds of these civil service, of these political appointee jobs left open. And you cannot make your imprint unless you put the professional politician or the political representative of the president at the top of an agency. And that's his big failure. If the next president who wants to deal with the swamp and bend it to his will is going to do that.
And he's going to be ideologically.
If it's Biden, he will do it.
He will do it. He knows where to find the swamp creatures, and he's going to. This is the
some
thing.
Of them he likes, and some of them he doesn't. Just like all of us.
Yes, I have struggled with this kind of topic my entire career, because when I started as a baby radio producer with Abdul, who is Indiana swamp to the T, he would always argue with me saying, you want a professional legislature that is full-time, because you need lobbyists, you need all these professionals because they understand how this works. And it's similar to what you've seen, your high school friends and epidemiologists on Facebook. Well, as a person who's been around politics my entire life, I see what people say, and it's totally detached from anything that anyone who's worked in politics experiences. So it's sort of like there's a lot in politics, like when somebody's watching a football game and they think they could be head coach better than the head coach. Meanwhile, they haven't spent 75 hours a week in a tape room making decisions, working with people on these, but their gut instinct tells them that they'd be better than the coach. And that's one of the disconnects that I think with libertarians a lot of times is, if you get elected, you are now in a world where you're dealing with these people. Like we have a gubernatorial candidate here who has a real shot to win in a three-way race. What happens if he wins? Because the majority of the people that are driving him to victory are largely disconnected and unknowledgeable about the tasks that they would undertake if they got elected to office. Right. And there is no incentive for anyone to learn, because the populist streak within the libertarian movement means if you do a show like we do, you're going to get killed because you're liberal or you're big, your state. It's like, no, I'm trying to help you understand how this stuff works so you can actually change it, as opposed to just screaming, because that's not gonna change it. So there's a big disconnect between how government functions and how we talk about it.
Well, and I think there's a disconnect between our own personal expectations and how we feel about other people, and the way government has to function too. It's always compared to making sausage. You don't want to see how sausage is made. You don't want to see how politics is made. And politics is the art of the possible. And I was just thinking as we're talking about this, one of the interesting experiments in this was Macron's government. He came essentially. He created his own party. He brought in a lot of young people who had never been in government, who got elected to the parliament, and by and large, he's kept them in the fold. But that they would start to be nibbled away at the edges as they find out they have to make this compromise or that compromise, and of course he's gone up and down in the popular polls and all that, but he is a living experiment in bringing in people who've never been involved in government into the legislature. So, and it's hard. It would be nice if you had some regular replacement. You and I both know that in the Congress, some 90+ % of the congressmen are reelected. The number who change is you can count them on one or two hands every election. Unless you have one of these major cycle, blowout kind of election, and where you lose 20, 30 seats and all that. But it doesn't happen very often.
Did you see The Swamp on HBO? It was a documentary about Matt Gaetz and Thomas Massie, and it was a great illustration. Like I give the benefit of the doubt to MAGA land in them saying they want to drain the swamp, and a guy like Matt Gaetz. You find him so much more likable as a regular human being instead of a screaming mouthpiece on cable news, and he's lying to people because that's what the people want. That's what they want to hear. But I think he genuinely believes in reform to kind of drain the swamp. But he's willing to play the game and bamboozle people. But then you look at Thomas Massie, who's not, and he's not willing to do the work that he hates, and he's always in trouble with his caucus. And so I think the MAGA world is a great example of a group of people who are ideological about certain things, but then once they get a taste of power, they get into Washington, D.C., you've got a whole new swamp created of all these people trying to sucker people out of their money, and you end up with the last 3 Trump campaign managers getting arrested.
So the only answer is that the swamp is everyone else.
Right.
Which is true. And again, as I've said time and again, I am so glad on some days that the civil service is there. They get out the Social Security checks and the Medicare payments, and they make sure the defense programs function, and the borders more or less operate, and this goes and that goes. And
you're a small C conservative. Institutions are necessary for incremental change and a lack of chaos.
Yeah, I like lack of chaos, and I do think as we go into this election on Tuesday, I do think that's going to be, what is the real driver for people's votes? You and I have not yet talked about the election, and we both woke up this morning to 2 new polls, one in Florida and one in Pennsylvania. As I was saying to you earlier, the Washington Post says Biden leads slightly in Pennsylvania, with Florida toss-up polls show. Well, it's only like a half a point difference in who leads where. Yeah. So it should have said Biden leads marginally in Pennsylvania, Trump leads marginally in Florida.
Yeah.
Still some interesting undecideds in some of these places. I think that I'm having a hard time for the first time kind of calling an election. My instinct is that, yesterday, before this poll came out, I thought, well, Florida was gradually moving into Biden's camp. Now, and this morning I'm thinking, well, maybe not. But the big question is, and this is the big problem for all the polling guys, is most of the country has voted already. Yeah. And they voted as far back as 3 weeks ago on issues that were salient to them 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, the market was up. 2 weeks ago, it was down. This week, GDP is way up. So if you're voting today and you're voting on economic issues, which, by the way, is what is the main driver of most people's votes, consumer confidence is up at 54% or something like that.
There was
it's been a little bit.
The Gallup poll that said 60% of people were better off today than they were 4 years ago in the middle of a recession.
Back to the Reagan thing. Absolutely. So I think it's going to be very hard. And kudos to whatever pollster is figuring out how to sample the people who've already voted and where they're landing. I have not seen anywhere any analysis of that. Texas is already, more people have voted in Texas absentee or early than voted in 2016, which was a blowout.
Yeah, there's probably by the time we record this on Sunday, November 1st, about 100 million will have voted early or absentee. And
We're
then
right at 100.
Yeah, and then another 50 million will vote on Tuesday. That's a large chunk of people. And I do think that Ann Selzer is one of the most reliable pollsters in Iowa. And she basically showed this massive shift, a 7-point shift towards Trump in Iowa, which is kind of something that I think we're seeing here in Indiana in this governor's race with the Republican governor shedding 15%. There's two central questions. The main central question of this election is, can you stomach 4 more years of Donald Trump? And the second question is, what do you think about lockdowns and who's going to prevent more lockdowns? I think the lockdowns are the wild card in this. And if Donald Trump does win, despite all the thousands of polls showing he has no shot, it is the last minute expansion of COVID and the resentment and fear of lockdowns that will drive people towards him. But you're right. There's 100 million people that have voted.
I would not say, I today would still not say that Trump will not win.
Okay.
I think a couple of weeks ago, I thought it was trending towards Biden, and I think Biden's momentum, if you look at the polling data, is actually, the gap is narrowing, which it always does. The public, once they have to make a choice, they make a choice. I will not be surprised if the third-party candidates do better than is predicted right now. I think there are going to be a number of people going into the polling booth on Tuesday. They're going to say, geez, I just cannot stomach this guy, and I don't want to vote for the other one. And so I actually think that will go up. And if that happens, that's bad for Biden. That was bad for Hillary. That lost her the election ultimately. So, but boy, this map, looking at it, is really phenomenal. And I wouldn't be surprised if Texas goes. Texas had, I think, what was the number, 2 million or 1.5 million new residents since the last election 4 years ago. It's huge. And people are moving into Arizona, a ton of people there. Florida had,
Georgia,
nearly 1 million. Georgia, I'm listening to the mayor of Raleigh-Durham yesterday, and they had 100 and some thousand, if I recall, and there. And so the people moving are moving into areas which are urban, and they are many are technologists and professionals, and by and large they're coming out of the Midwest and off the coast and other places. And I don't think that helps Trump particularly.
Well, he has to win. So for Trump to win, he has to win the states he won last time. He has to win.
Right. Well, he can lose too.
Okay, so
but he definitely needs to win either Florida or Pennsylvania, I think.
Yeah,
and I think his best bet is still still Michigan. Today I'd say Florida. Wouldn't be surprised on Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania seems to be narrowing.
I think Pennsylvania, because it has the largest number of white working class without a college degree, which he does really well in. You've got the riots in Philadelphia happening again.
Right.
You've got the oil comments. I could see Pennsylvania flipping very easily. I could see seniors are most impacted by both the pandemic and lockdowns.
Right.
My grandfather, as I've mentioned on the shows, in a nursing home, and so is my grandmother. But he, she's in memory care, and his life is just turned upside down. And
you can't go visit him, can you?
You can now sit across the table, but that's probably going to change. You know what I mean? Even though the facility is making that call, not anyone in government, there's still, I think, going to be some part of people that go, I'm in this horrible situation, and Biden's probably going to make this worse, so I'm going to vote for the anti-lockdown candidate, which is Trump. And I could see that, plus the economic stuff tightening a lot of these things in places like Florida, despite the fact that Donald Trump, as a polling last week in the senior category, he won it by 17 points in 2016. He's now only winning it by 2. In whites, in a CNN poll 2 days ago, he won whites across the nation by 20 points. He's now only winning it by 2. So you see these little signs of it tightening, but does he win Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan? All these, Iowa's done. He's won that. Ohio, I don't know that
Ohio's dropped out of the conversation. It's clear that Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Arizona are the guys.
Now the Trump's campaign says they're gearing up in Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Florida for litigation.
Right. Well, they're going to litigate everywhere. Well, the good thing, if there is anything good about most of this, is that it's great if you're a political watcher.
I'm having the time of my life. I don't know about you.
No, it's fascinating, and we're actually doing with our small pod of 6 friends an election eve thing at my house. I've just gotten 5 HEPA filter machines. And I just bought an outdoor heater, and hopefully we'll have dinner outside. And I'm going to have I've got a 6-foot, TV. I've got a huge TV, and of course I'll be watching. And my wife says nobody else wants to watch it. You'll just have to report us. We'll be drinking, and of course I'll be drinking. but where was I? I can't remember where I was going on that, but
just how the lockdowns. A lot of this is people,
what's going to affect it.
Trump's messaging, and he's running a very online campaign talking about people like Miles Taylor that nobody cares about Hunter Biden. Like people didn't. You tell me, but people didn't care about Billy Carter. They didn't care about
Roger
Clinton.
I still have my Billy Carter beer.
Right. They don't care about Hunter Biden. That's stuff that Republicans care about. But what they care about is how they're personally affected. Am I going to recover from this economically better with Trump or Biden? Who's going to lock me down, even though neither has the power to do it? And then, it's me. It's sort of how does it affect?
Yeah.
And so I don't. And largely, it just comes down to who do you coalition with? Are you right or are you left? And I think there's think there's more people on center left in this country, and I just can't see him statistically running the table like he needs to. I don't think it's impossible. I do think it's.
You mean Trump running it?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible that impossible.
I think
Trump
he's got
wins.
some latitude. I think last time you and I got on, the Post had just published their model where you can, and I suggest people go, and I think you may have put it on the website of where you can pick states to go one way or another and pick your own path. I think people should be doing that because I think I'd do it election eve, and I'd be doing it now if you were taking bets.
270 to win is a great website.
270 to win. That's right.
Yep.
I think the other interesting. So the things that make this a difficult election are shifting populations, shifting demographics. Many people think of Latinos as a single-minded entity, but you have Cuban Americans who tend to vote Republican, although they're less Republican than they used to be. You have in Florida, you have, I think it's the largest Puerto Rican population in anywhere, including Puerto Rico or New York in North and Central Florida, and they tend to vote Democratic, although less so now. As they become more business centric.
The Venezuelan population there is
Venezuelans,
really big now.
the Venezuelan population doesn't typically vote, but they're noisy in Florida. You have Salvadorians who've been there a long time who do vote. They have very mixed interests, and then of course out in West you have Mexican Americans and in addition to some of these others, and they have a variety of things. And you and I both know the polls are showing that Latinos as a group, Latino men and Black men are actually, Trump has made some gains there, like 2 or 3, 4% in what he did in 2016. So that's interesting. Although he's of course losing more and more among women and white women and educated and so on and so forth. What I have not heard, what I'm not hearing that I heard in abundance in 2016 is. I said my brother, for example, began the election by saying, I would never vote for Trump He's a lifelong Republican like me. And he ended the election with, I would never vote for Hillary. So, Trump managed to make it about Hillary more than about himself. And I am not hearing a similar thing now, although Trump is banging on Biden and the Democrats as socialists and communists, which has some salience, to the Cuban community, but not as much as it used to. We're under the 5th generation of Cubans here. Yeah. And my friends who in that community, by and large, are much more liberal than their parents, and they are further away. Although I think some of them have they're now trying to grab their roots back, and some of them don't speak Spanish anymore, and they want their kids to do that, and so it's very interesting. I think when all is said and done, though, I would give a slight edge to Biden. I think based on the early vote, I guess I would probably say Trump will probably not win Florida, but it will be called early because Florida has been counting ballots. If I recall correctly, I think North Carolina has been counting ballots. North Carolina is going to be very interesting. I think the race with Lindsey Graham is going to be a nail biter. I think, and we have a bunch of Senate races like that. Unfortunately, I think Susan Collins is going to lose. One of the ill effects of this kind of polarization is that the moderates, the centrists in both parties, end up being kicked out. So it gets harder and harder to actually get anything done in Washington and in the swamp, if you want to call it. Tom Cottons of the world, who is a brilliant guy, but he's an uncompromising, guy. And
so looking at this, I hope
it's terrible.
I hate Tom Cotton. I think Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley are the worst.
You're too. I had high hopes, but I think they're the worst. I like Ben Sass in Nebraska, but I think he's lost his determination, notwithstanding his reaction. We talked about it last time, so it's gonna be hard.
There's a great website called isidewith.com where you can kind of see who you coalition with the best, and you take this quiz. And I am, as most libertarians ought to be, they're on the opposite end of big government liberalism, active intervention into the economy, and intervention across the seas. I don't see any difference between Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, and Hillary Clinton. They may say, "Oh, we're for limited government," but they're basically on that same spectrum as Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton in terms of the government can do good things for you, and it's all about intervening in personal and military lives. But so when you look at the Senate race, the Senate map, you've got
Senate doesn't look good for Republicans.
It started out looking good, and you touched on it.
It started. Yeah, I agree with that.
You had in 2016 Donald Trump promising things, and we always talk about how the public loves free stuff, right? You were going to get a wall, you were going to get Supreme Court justices, you were going to
Mexicans were going to pay for it,
right? What you're getting this time is you're going to get 4 more years of outrage at the people that personally offend Donald Trump. He's going to hate on Leslie Stahl. He's going to hate on. There's not really much in terms of for those independent voters. If you are in that 43% of the country that lives for outrage at hypocrisy, then Donald Trump's your guy. But what do you do with that other 57%? You've got to do something to kind of break out of that. And he's dragging the Senate. There's no reason that John Cornyn in Texas and Montana and the 2 seats in Georgia and Tom Tillis in North Carolina, they shouldn't be in play, but they're in play because the top of the ticket has no real closing message. They've never really defined Joe Biden in any way. And you're right. If he had stuck to he's a big government, pro-lockdown, high taxation candidate, the economy's better under me, and he had just beaten that drum, if Trump had been disciplined from the beginning, this would be a much different race than Leslie Stahl was mean to me, Hunter Biden. That stuff just doesn't work. It's he failed, and they're going to end up, in my opinion, the Democrats are going to take 51 to 53 seats because across the board, and
I agree.
All those down ticket races, there's no reason that in Indiana Dan Burton's seat in the 5th District is going to go to a Democrat. And within that district is the Indiana Speaker of the House's district. And he's going to, it's going to flip, and he may lose. Like that, the lack of...
So what you're predicting in some ways is a down ballot route.
Yeah.
And again, I would not be surprised about that. And you and I have talked about targeting of the second tier targeting. It's not just Senate races per se and House broadly and the presidency, but there are like 10 or 12 congressional seats that are really important to flip delegations for redistricting.
Yeah.
Which will happen right after the end here. And, the Democrats enjoyed a redistricting advantage for about 60 years, and then Republicans have gradually gotten it over the last 30 years. And I think it's probably going to flip back. And
they really punished the Republicans punished them 10 years ago, and that's why they've done really well. And I cannot stress, if you are a Republican listening to this program, you should be so furious with your party because they have put you in such a poor disadvantage for redistricting in the next 10 years by holding on to Donald Trump, who is personally out for Donald Trump and not for your collective interest. I'll never understand the cult-like following this guy has built because he's so... Like, Lindsey Graham is just hung out to dry. He hasn't campaigned with Lindsey Graham once. Like...
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. And Lindsey Graham has been hanging on to him like, it's his long-lost brother. He's Bobbsey twins or something. Yeah. Well, So but you raised something earlier, which I think is an important question, which is when it's over, what's it going to be like? And what would you do if you were, let's say, a Biden or a Trump? First of all, I don't think it's going to be like, if Biden loses, I don't think it's going to be like 2016, where you had just this fervor, particularly among many women, for Hillary Clinton. And she had a real following. Biden is, and the first woman kind of thing, Biden is he's a politician. He's experienced. He's not flashy. I don't think he'll be a
boring campaign where he hid out in the basement. Is part of why
I think it's worked. It's great.
He never came out. He pissed off the far right and far left by never coming out and saying what he stood for, because no one could define him. And he's boring, and that's why his favorables are at 52% and Hillary's were at 43%.
But if he loses, I don't think you will have the phenomenon you had after Hillary lost, which is this total non-acceptance of the election results. I have said numerous times on the show that I think in many respects, Donald Trump has the right to be constantly pissed off because he was never accepted early on. You had a Democratic congresswoman calling for his impeachment before he was ever sworn in. This is true, not apocryphal.
Al Green. Yeah.
And you have people who have been against him from the beginning. He is right. The press has been against him from the beginning. He used the press, but now the press made him. But he has never had a favorable press for just about anything. And I had an interesting exchange with a friend of mine the other day via text, and she was saying, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, there are some good things. There are some things that he has done that I think are good. But he is just such an overwhelming jackass. And I personally can't take what he says about the military and soldiers. Why are these guys stupid or whatever for going over to fight? And so I'm not going to vote for him. And, I've said it before, even though I'm a lifelong Republican. But, and she said, I've just been waiting for you to tell me that. And she's a much more conservative Republican than I am. And so I think if there are people, the 30% of the public that's going to vote on Tuesday, I think they're going to come down to, how am I doing? That's great. I'm doing fine. But gee whiz, do I want 4 more years of this just constant bickering and dissonance? And if Biden wins, then the question is, how will he reach out? Yes, how will Trump react? But how will he reach out? Can he reach out to these disaffected voters? And, a lot of them voted, many of them voted for Obama. So he can remind them of that. But I'm not, I think if Trump wins, he's definitely not going to reach out. But if he were to win, I would not be surprised if he abandoned the Trumpistas in the party on some issues. I think fundamentally he has no ideology or political philosophy. So he'll want to do deals, and maybe Trump Unleashed, I hate to use that term, might produce some things that are good. But I
just
think
don't.
The press will be way against him. And then, of course, he's trying to build a dynasty. His kids, Don Jr. and Ivanka has all of a sudden, we now see, has become pro-life. And the smarmy answer the other day, and I've forgotten who did the interview, but probably Fox. So
yeah. So here's my counter to almost all. So let's say Trump wins. Trump,
right?
As Jonah Goldberg pointed out, and I would kind of put you and I in kind of the center right bulwark dispatch kind of crowd, and that's why we have an aversion to Donald Trump, but we definitely aren't pro Biden, like in the way that those guys are, because of basically big government liberalism and interventionism. But you're right that Trump never got a fair shake, and I think he has every right to be upset about that. But he never helped himself. And I treat Donald Trump like I would treat any other human being. I don't see him as supernatural. He had the opportunity. Now, I'm not arguing for this as a policy point of view. I'm saying this is what Bannon proposed. Do an infrastructure bill as your first act. Build a bridge, a coalition. Spend money in every district. So for 4 years, you fly in there and go, "I built you that bridge." But his instinct was to continue to fight the Russiagate stuff, to litigate that, and he Streisand affected all that into an existence, and finally gave them something to impeach him on. He didn't, by focusing on that solely, he hurt himself. I don't think that condition is going to change. Day one, if he wins, they're going to try and impeach him on something else, and he's going to give it to him because he can't. Anything that Donald Trump, as Goldberg pointed out the other day, anything that Donald Trump didn't have involvement in succeeded, and it's the stuff that conservatives like. Most of that was because of Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and the adults in the room around him, the McMasters and the Boltons and the people that he hates. Everything that Donald Trump did poorly on, like COVID, he had a personal hand in. And so now, who is going to go work for him in a second term? You're not going to get adults. You're going to get grifters. You're going to get people like the guy that just got ushered out of, that we talked about, that was doing all these weird streams, and all the best to his health. But you're not going to get effective people in a second term. You're just going to get more of what Donald Trump wants, which is you talking about Donald Trump, which, and if Joe Biden wins, Joe Biden for a brief period will have 60% of this country kind of go, like they did with Donald Trump, I'm going to give you a chance. Let's just see how he does as president. But the second he rolls out some big environmental policy or big healthcare policy or whatever, you're going to have Tea Party 2.0. You're going to have a realignment. You're also going to have internecine warfare. Yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at Joe Biden as president, he's going to be a lame duck from day one. He's going to be attacked by all the wings of his party because they want the 2024 nomination. You're going to have them eating each other. You're going to have the Republicans eating each other. Trump winning is only going to probably divide the party and will kill off the libertarian streak in the Republicans. So I'm not as panicked about a Biden presidency because I see it as disruptive as a Trump presidency in a lot of ways.
I would give you that. I agree with all that. And by the way, the infrastructure bill, I don't disagree with anything you said. But the infrastructure bill, for example, is a very good example of the party swamp dealing him a bad hand. So, Mitch McConnell didn't really want to do that. And Elaine Chao, Secretary of Transportation, really didn't want to do that.
Right.
And this is where the old fashioned, we can't blow the budget stuff, the short term vision versus the long term. Anybody with a jot of intelligence knows that if you rebuild infrastructure, you're going to have instant hits in the economy, and it's going to instantly improve it's like infrastructure is like oil in grease, not oil, big oil, like grease in making the moving parts move faster. And this is where, if there were one thing he could have done to make himself a president who was president and to knock everybody off on their butt, that would have been
nobody expected.
But he lost that to the Republican swamp.
Yeah, nobody expected.
No one else can be blamed.
I never thought Donald Trump was a libertarian. He was a Democrat 2 weeks before. He wanted he wanted a bigger stimulus bill than Pelosi did in that first round. He's libertarians would have hated Donald Trump, and then a portion of them would have found a way to love him because of non-interventionism. But
because their check was big enough. Well, the non-interventionism is a big thing. Anybody else would have been applauded for that. And
he should be.
But yeah, and then of course the foreign policy swamp is yet another, the establishment, and everybody's wringing their hands, but they've stopped wringing their hands. I think if Biden wins, however, he's got a huge opportunity. He will have all of these countries under the thumb of tariffs, and he can pull the thumb up gradually or quickly. He can make deals. Yeah. He'll be able to do the stimulus bill if the Congress doesn't do it first. And so he'll have gas, the pushing the pedal down there for the economy. I think he has a lot of opportunities, and I think his instincts are not radical. But so the left is going to be disappointed on some things, but I think, there'll be more environmental stuff. That's fine. And there'll be more climate stuff. There should be more climate stuff. I mean, there's bound to be a way to deal with that. I'm one of these people who thinks, well, even if it's not human caused, there are things you can see and do something about. So do something about it. And it'll be, I don't think it'll be radical per se, but I do agree with you that it can be a big administration and big change, and it will cause ripples in both parties. I think I am not sanguine that Republicans will regroup intelligently, but I can say, and you would say the same, come 2024, it's going to be a riot of candidates.
Oh yeah, I mean
not going to run.
The most important election of your lifetime begins on Wednesday. I think it all depends on how much Biden wins by. Determines on how revolutionary this administration would be. So if you look at the historical precedent, you look at 88 or 92. I mean, when Clinton wins, it's by 1 to 2 points. He's now constrained and does a lot of conservative things because he was in a conservative position. You look at 80. Well, Reagan could do a lot more because he won by 3 to 5 points, and he had more of a mandate. Then you look at 32 when Roosevelt wins by 7, 8 points. Then it's Roosevelt, for God's sake. So, the mandate stuff and the license, and then not to mention, let's say they have 57 seats in the Senate. It's a total blowout, and it's a big blue wave. And Biden has an 8-point win, 400 electoral college votes, 57 Senate seats, almost a majority in the House. Well, that is a terrifying prospect, and so I do think that fear is going to kind of limit him to 1 to 2 points. I think Biden. Yeah. I think the math for Trump, it's not impossible, but it's really hard, and I think people are just exhausted with him. I think there's a lot of conservatives. Yeah. When we look at the Expl that go, we got Amy Coney Barrett, we got 3. He did his job. I'm just tired of defending him.
Yeah, I think, and by the way, speaking of Barrett, I've been thinking about this too. My prediction is if the Democrats win, I would not be surprised if they added 2 seats to the Supreme Court. But more likely, what they should do is add more seats to the appellate level and to the level below that. Because, we've added, the Republican sides and conservatives have added, 170, some huge number of judges. And I think the Democrats, as soon as they get in, they're going to realize what that strategy was. And the courts are continually overutilized. So they're going to add another layer to that, which is what they should do. With Carter, they did that. Yeah, so they have more judges to appoint.
I agree because
Yeah.
the court packing thing in terms of the Supreme Court is a non-starter because you have to fight for 2 to 4 months to kill the filibuster. Then you got to get 2/3. Still have to.
Where they're going to end the filibuster?
Yeah, and then you've got basically a 2-long-year fight, and you're going to suck up all the oxygen that keeps you from doing anything that you promised that you were going to do. Nobody's run on it. Nobody's saying that they're going to do this. It's just kind of a liberal scare tactic that I don't, a conservative scare tactic too. Like I don't see the court packing thing happening because there's like why
you don't see the Supreme Court packing.
Right.
happening.
I think your scenario is much more likely. That makes a lot more sense.
Right. Yeah, and that's sort of out of sight, out of mind. By the way, so
this is the caravan of 2020. Like as soon as the election is over, the caravan disappeared. So will court packing.
Well, so it's ticking towards us, isn't it?
I know. I'm sort of sad that it's going to disappear. It's been a lot of fun. What a crazy year. It's going to be a long, dark winter without all the arguments that we have. Do you think that? Let me ask you this quickly before we go on. But do you think there will be violence from either side, and do you think there will be a long, contracted court fight, or do you think it's going to be? I don't see either taking place, but I'm interested in your perspective.
I thought Florida was more likely to be very clear than I think it is now. Right now, I am not sure Florida is going to be clear. Although, if the polling now is Trump slightly ahead, that mainly only refers to in-person voters coming up in Tuesday. So the Democrats really did their job earlier, and that's why I think Florida is probably still likely to go for Biden this time, marginally. And if that's the case, Florida will be harder to challenge, but I expect a challenge. I think a couple of these other states are going to be a little more difficult. I don't expect Trump to concede on election eve. Unless some massive rout that we're not predicting right now happens. And I do think that there will be litigation, but I don't think it will change the outcome. I think the key states are going to be the ones we know. It's going to be Michigan, Florida, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona. And I think Arizona, if I had to lay money on it right now, I'd probably say Arizona's going to go for Biden as well. And so that's the nail in the coffin. So I expect to see, some lawsuits for a couple of weeks. I also expect some violence. Honestly, Chris, I think, on both sides. If Biden were to lose, if Trump is to lose, you're going to see it. It's going to depend entirely on the candidates. It's going to, now, Biden can't control Antifa, but Trump can control his people.
And he won't.
So I expect some violence.
He tweeted the video yesterday saying, "Go Texas," basically.
The one of the bus. Oh, yeah. Gee whiz.
I mean,
God.
Joking last week about Biden being assassinated and Kamala coming in, and the crowd just went silent and looked at each other.
Well, but you're underscoring what may be the final motivator to people in the election booth, which is, do you really want 4 more years of just this incessant drumbeat of inanity and it's uncouth and unsavory and do you want more of it? And I think in the end, some percentage of voters are going to just say, like me, there are things I like, but not much, by the way. But there's no way I could vote for this again. And so I think that's going to be the last straw. So we'll see.
All right, so we end the program with recommendations. So if you visit the nation's capital someday in some far-off land when the pandemic has ended and Washington, D.C. allows you in their borders, are you able to visit D.C. and dine, or you got any?
Well, I'm actually up here today.
Okay.
And there are a couple new ones that have opened, but actually what I'm going to do is a little segue. So I just spent 2 weeks driving across country to visit my,
really,
my wife and I rented a car for a one-way drive from our island on the Chesapeake Bay from the island on the Chesapeake Bay we took 2 days in Asheville, a day in Memphis, went to the, Biltmore in Asheville and this and that. And then we went to the Elvis Museum in Memphis. And then we went up to Tulsa to see Woody Guthrie's, the museum there. It's just a wonderful museum. And then went on down to Bentonville, Arkansas, where Alice Walton of the Walton family, she's the world's wealthiest woman, I think $64 billion, has created one of the most fabulous museums and settings that you can imagine anywhere, where we stayed in a really great little hotel called the Museum Hotel, which is a hotel with the museum in it, and what is reputed to be the best restaurant in Bentonville, which may or may not be saying a lot, but it's called the Hive.
There's Casey's General Store.
Yeah. Well, and when you travel, you should look up there. It's a great, used to be great, is it called the Road Food, which was a lot of little joints all along the way. And we managed to find some really great barbecue joints and this and that on the way. And then we drove from Bentonville to Dallas, where my daughter and 3-year-old granddaughter and son-in-law live. And we have big news on that front, which is we are expecting a grandson.
Excellent.
Now on my birthday, roughly in April. And then the 5 of us drove for a couple of days to Austin, rented an Airbnb house with a pool and went hiking around. And then my wife and I took 2 more days while they went back to Dallas and went to wine country in Texas. And so my substitute for meals in DC might be wine in Texas. Who knew they had wine in Texas, right? And they have the massive wine growing area in the valley is what they call it, and then they bring grapes in from other places. But we went to a number of terrific small wineries. I did a study of wineries and wine back at the beginning of this year, and what we discovered, which probably some people knew already, is that about 85% of all wineries in this country sell about 85% of all of their wine within 50 miles of where the winery is sited. So they are entertainment experiences rather than, for the fabulousness of the wine. And but one vineyard that we went to where they grow their own, and it's a guy who went to Rice University, where I went, and his sister who went to Stanford, and they have a family winery that was started in, I think, about 1999. Their parents retired and decided to do it. He was an ex-IBM, and it's called Pedernales Cellars. And if you happen to be in a wine store and they have out-of-state wine, it's actually pretty good. A couple of their wines, and they do good Tempranillos in Texas and in some parts of Texas, not all over. And they do a decent Viognier, which we have in Virginia. It's white, and it's great with turkey. And of course, we're all getting ready for Thanksgiving and trying to figure out how to deal with that, COVIDly, in a way that we are all safe. We're telling everybody they have to have a COVID test before they come. And we wait to hear what my brother has to say about that.
Well,
he's from Florida.
I'm on a different podcast called The Pat Down, and she told me in Atlanta you can buy a fake COVID test that shows negative. So, anyway, take a good long look.
And then
that.
we flew back. So, and we flew back to my cooking a steak.
Yes. I haven't had steak in forever.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Steak, yeah. Well, you should do that sometime.
I love steak. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, Rob.
Yeah.
So
this is going to be interesting with a cleanup after the election.
You were one of the first things you told me. You bragged about you being one of the few people predicting a Trump win. I mean, you're very declarative on that last election. Do you want to make one final declaration?
I think Biden will win.
Okay.
But Trump's going to give everybody a scare.
All right.
If you're an anti-Trumper.
Yeah. I would say that that's probably about right. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
So if everybody wants to bet me a cocktail, I'll do a cocktail.
Thank you for joining us here on We Are Libertarians. Yeah. We will see you again in a couple days. And please share this episode if you got something out of it. Recommendations are the lifeblood of a podcast, so we appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.